Abolition. So Rabbi Ari Lev and I had the great honor of getting to organize together in Philadelphia for many years and try to support the movements for police and prison abolition and justice. And alongside our work in movements in Philadelphia have been kind of, I think, Havruta long-term study partners and bouncing ideas off of each other about what is our tradition, what does Jewish tradition have to offer the deep need for different ways of being together when we hurt each other and different ways of repairing harm. So I'm really excited to bring that conversation, or just one small slice of that conversation, to us tonight.
Hey all, my name's Ari Lev. I use he and they pronouns. Just as a point of access, I'm a white trans person with dark curly hair, sitting in this kind of decorative corner of my basement. And it's really an honor to get to learn Torah in the presence of the Hanukkah candles burning. There's something that feels especially meditative and holy about that opportunity. So grateful to Melissa and Alyssa for making it happen, and Rebecca and Rachel for all the ways that you're contributing and lifting up this space. And I come to this as a person who, and I want to offer you two frameworks for how we can kind of enter studying the Torah of Abolition. I bring kind of a fierce commitment in my heart, though in truth, it feels like it lives more in my bones. Like it's hard to talk about the Torah of Abolition without getting teary because there's so much at stake. Like the Torah of Abolition and the practice of abolition and the movement for abolition is a movement rooted in, life and death struggle, which is not new to members of Jewish Voice for Peace and the struggles for the people of Palestine and frankly, the people of indigenous lands all over the world, including here on Turtle Island. But it's really important for us to hold that what is at stake in the question of abolition is the question of survival. And the question of how we can move from a framework of survival to living, to thriving, to freedom, to real liberation, and what we as individuals and what Judaism as a tradition can contribute to that. And one of the reasons I find it especially powerful to teach about this in the context of Jewish Voice for Peace is because Judaism has been co-opted and reframed in modern and contemporary life as a colonial project. But it's really my deep understanding and deep belief that in its heart, Jewish tradition and rabbinic texts were deeply anti-fascist, anti-government, anti-police, anti-prisons, and abolitionist in their thinking. And so part of what we're doing is actually reclaiming and recovering a tradition that's been waiting for us to understand it as an abolitionist movement, and that has been co-opted by colonial forces. But so much of the fertile ground is there. So I want to invite us to first just live into what's at stake in the conversation. And I know that we bring different positionality to that. So for those of our many identities that we hold and our many experiences and encounters with policing and prisons, to know that a lot is at stake for each of us individually and all of us collectively, and different things are at stake depending on where we're positioned. I also want to invite us to bring a beginner's mind. The truth is that the texts that I'm going to be sharing with you in just a bit are texts that I've studied. It wouldn't be overstating to say dozens of times. I've studied and taught these exact texts that we're going to look at tonight dozens of times in dozens of contexts, and I learn something new from them every time. When we look at, and so it's important to bring beginner's mind also for the kind of openness and chesed that inspires. And abolition, everything I understand about the movement for abolition and the visionaries, largely Black trans women and Black women who have made it possible, is that it's a visionary movement about possibility. And so it's important for us to actually create a stance within our own hearts and minds of possibility, a kind of softening, a kind of opening, almost, it's good to do this late at night, right? Like almost a blurring of what's true. Because I can say for myself, I had a drink earlier today. I'm already on water. It was Shabbat Hanukkah. Like it's good to just soften in whatever way that happens for you, because abolition is about sort of seeing through the cracks of what's true and towards something that's actually more true, right? Seeing through the cracks of what's true towards something more true. So I want to invite us to bring both, the intensity of our commitment, the question of what's at stake, and beginner's mind to this conversation. I also want to just sort of name as a fundamental truth, there were hundreds of hours of texts that we could study tonight. And I offer you that actually as something that should be incredibly encouraging. Like, what I can't wait to be part of writing is the book called The Torah of Abolition. Jessica knows I'm really wanting to dream this up. There's books and books to write about how to read rabbinic text and biblical text with a deeply abolitionist framework. So it could look like, oh, it's just these 3 sources. It's not. I spent the summer like really doing archival research and finding sources. It's dozens and dozens and dozens of sources. And one could say it's at the heart of actually Jewish religious thought, you know, let's say pre-Holocaust is probably a good way to look at it. Pre-Nazi Holocaust. So those are by way of framings. Jessica, before we jump in, is there anything you want to add to that, or are we text study ready?
Should we just tell people the light outline?
Yeah, sure. Great. So what you can expect are kind of 2 parts to our conversation. The first, we're going to be studying some rabbinic sources on the practice of Teshuva. Teshuva being a Jewish word that means repair, transformation, restoration. In its heart, it actually means return. And after that, we're going to attempt to go into what we're going to call like an application, conversation. How do we apply this to our lives, either relative to our work with Jewish Voice for Peace, relative to our own personal lives, our own hearts, or in a larger context. So we're going to hone in on these texts, and then we're going to see how we can apply them. And by way of framing, one of the reasons we started with the concept of tshuva is because rather than looking at texts that are about punishment or policing, we wanted to look at actually what's more true than the question of how Judaism frames punishment. Because actually, just as like a spoiler alert, Judaism in its essence doesn't believe in prisons or policing as a form of punishment. You won't find it. If you wanna kind of go down a dark trail looking for it, I can send you my notes, or you can see a footnotes in a sermon I recently delivered at Kol Tzedek where on Yom Kippur. But in essence, the concepts of prison and policing are not Jewish concepts. And so that's led, Jessica and I to really be asking, what are Jewish concepts? And so one of the practices of abolition is saying it's a visionary practice to say, not how can we fix or, fix a broken system, which is the conversation about kind of like remediating policing, but it's actually, what could the system be? And that's the question for abolition. So we want to look at tshuva as the foundation of Jewish theology around abolition. And that's where we're going to begin this conversation. And frankly, Alyssa, because you put your wish out there, hopefully this will be the first of many text studies that we have around the Torah of Abolition and writing that theology together as a community of activists and learners and engaged Jews. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And for this first part, given the size that we're going to be going into breakout rooms for the second part. But for this first part, I'm actually going to sort of teach us through the text orally. But I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to invite folks to use the chat as a way to surface their ideas and engage with some of these questions. And this source sheet, for those for whom it would be easier visually to access it yourself, this is a link to the source sheet that I'm sharing. And it's also available indefinitely. So it lives on Sefaria, which is an open source platform for Torah. And you can actually Google and find this and come back to it at a later date. So we begin. We begin with a passage from the Talmud. This comes from the Masechet called Masechet Pesachim. One might think it's the tractate dealing with laws related to Passover or the Passover offerings. But as is the way with Jewish conversation and rabbinic text, it is all free association. And so we jump into a section of Pesachim, which is actually currently in the Daf Yomi cycle, in the cycle of studying a page of Talmud a day. We're in this particular tractate, although a little bit earlier on. And in general, some of the chapters of this tractate are very, very curious about the nature of time days and nights, what makes something a day and night, and also lists about things that have happened in kind of crucial transition periods in time. This is a text that was kind of codified, the Talmud itself codified around the year 600, although what I'm bringing you is a much earlier teaching, probably somewhere between the year 0 and 200. So we're looking at a text that's easily 2,000 years old. Probably that's the youngest that it is. And it says, wasn't it taught? And it wasn't just taught anywhere, but it was taught in what's called a baraita. A baraita being an early early text that didn't make it into the Mishnah. The Mishnah being the 2nd century legal code, but is contemporary to it. The reason I'm sharing all of that is it's just helpful to understand how early this thought is, how deep of an inheritance this is, how solid of a root this is in Jewish thought. This is a text that is understood to have been taught around the year 100 at the latest, let's say. So wasn't it taught forever ago? 7 phenomena were created before the world was created. And they are Torah, repentance. This is our word we're looking for. This is the word Teshuva. The Garden of Eden, Gehenna, which is some version of a place of suffering after we die, something that Christians would call hell, probably. The throne of glory, the holy temple, as in the one that stood in Jerusalem where they made sacrificial offerings, and the name of the Messiah, the name of the anointed or appointed one. All right, I'll say that again. 7 phenomena were created before the world was created. Torah, Teshuva, the Garden of Eden, Gehenna, the throne of glory, the holy temple, and the name of the Messiah. So the first question that comes up when we're reading this list, actually the first thing we can orient to whenever we're reading a list in any rabbinic text is this list inclusive? Is this list inclusive or exclusive? Which is to say, were just these 7 things taught? Or are you teaching us that things were created before the world was created? So we always want to bring that critical question. I'm seeing Rebecca asking, what is the throne of glory? It's referred to as kisei hakavod. This phrase would be most familiar to you, perhaps, from the blessing that's recited after one goes to the bathroom. We refer to God as sitting on kisei hakavod, the holy throne, the throne of glory or honor. But it's actually in that place, my favorite part, it's a pun referring to the toilet. So this is the holy seat that God sits on. And we also give blessings for our ability to sit on the holy throne, AKA the toilet. So if you've come across the phrase, that's probably the most likely place. But it also is just something that comes up in Midrash is if we can if we're willing to anthropomorphize God or some sort of divine entity above, we can imagine some amazing throne holding all of that divine energy. And yes, that's a different text study, but there's definitely a blessing for going to the bathroom. Thank you. Okay, so the first question that arises for me is, why these 7 things? What do these things have in common? Are they connected to each other? This is a real live question. I'd love you to place your answers in the chat. Why these 7 things? Does it make sense to you as a list? What's missing? What would you take off of this list? Why these 7 things? And if anyone has a burning response, you're welcome to unmute and share it with the group. Okay, so Rin is sharing, and I apologize if in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name. Rin is sharing, it feels like a compilation of extremes on a continuum. So curious to know more of that. I'm curious to know what continuum this is.
I was thinking if I could just cut in for a second, and you did pronounce my name right, so thank you. The continuum of kind of, I guess, this isn't necessarily a continuum, but Garden of Eden and Gehenna sounds like 2 sort of oppositional structures. And then it I don't know, everything sort of seems like it's positioned in alignment from sort of one thing to the next in a way that just seems really interesting to me.
Thanks. There's kind of some sort of temporalness or experiential kind of scope for you. Great. So we're going to hold that question. It doesn't have to go anywhere. Why these 7 things? And then I want to zoom in on what are the implications of Teshuva being created before the world was created? Why would that be? Why would that be so? Why would the possibility of repair, restoration, return, healing, transformation, why would that be created before the world was created? Okay, so Anna's sharing because we need them to structure our lives Jewishly. Great, Anna, you might be thinking that actually about all of these things. These are all kind of foundational principles for how we might structure our lives. Raf shares, it gives a sense that creation of the world is always in progress. Yeah, I do think, Raf, it points to a kind of imperfectness of the world. Imperfect is actually kind of a grammatical term for the future tense, which is to say the in progressness of it all. Right? Not the indefiniteness of it. Because growth can't happen without it. That's certainly my sense of it. Because God knew it would be necessary. Yeah, the wisdom of it all. Or the rabbis who wrote this text. We don't even have to give divine attribution here. The rabbis are saying, how could the Holy One have created the world before Teshuva? We wouldn't function. Nicole's sharing, repair precedes humans so it can't be limited to humans. Great, so Jenna's saying the others feel like more fixed states, whereas Teshuva feels like it recognizes the need for change. And Tiffany's adding, we will always be in returning, be connected and engaged with it. Great, so we can flesh this out, but you could all imagine as someone who's deeply invested in abolition and in the prospect of there being a relational path towards healing, the idea that Teshuva precedes the creation of the world, doesn't precede the creation of humans, precedes the creation of the world, is fundamental to my own understanding of the importance of Teshuva, right? If we can imagine, it's second on the list. It's like Torah and Teshuva, right? So it just gives you a sense of how important it was for the rabbis. Yeah, Anna, the God is planning an imperfect world. Exactly, and we want to have a way of continually being in right relationship with it. I'm not talking about perfecting it, but actually returning to right relationship with it, by which Teshuva represents. Great, we are now going to jump ahead at least 1,000 years in this moment. So we're just going to hold that in one hand, and we're going to jump ahead about 1,000 years to the Mishnah Torah on one foot. The Mishnah Torah was written by Maimonides, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. He was a medieval, first of all, he was a medieval physician and a Torah scholar whose commentary on all of biblical and rabbinic thought is a prized part of the rabbinic tradition, but whose magnum opus is a 14-volume book called the Mishnah Torah, 14-volume book. It's a full bookshelf in all Hebrew. It's a full bookshelf when you have it in translation. And he attempts to reorganize all of rabbinic thought into his new 14-column system, which is quirky and doesn't really take off, just to put it well. Like, no one else is like, and forevermore there will be 14 individual ways of organizing Torah, but it remains one of the clearest codifications of Jewish thinking. And part of what's really unique about it is that it's the only comprehensive rabbinic text that we have that spans pre-temple, that precedes the destruction of the temple and includes the post-diasporic period as well. So it compiles both the sacrificial practices of the temple and the exilic practices of our contemporary rabbinic lives. And it's the only text that comprehensively does all of those things. It was also written in the context of Muslim Spain and North Africa, which was his context. And so it has some echoes to Muslim and Sharia law. And so it has a kind of punctuality to, a kind of clarity of practice that is otherwise elusive in much of rabbinic thinking. And so for all of these reasons, it is one of our go-to sources when we want to understand what a practice is. So we've jumped 1,000 years. We now theologically understand that tshuva is essential for the rabbis, but the question arises, what constitutes tshuva? So we're going to look, this is actually I think it's a 9-chapter kind of sub-book that we could look at, and each of those chapters has about a dozen laws within it. And we're going to look at, I think, 3 different individual halachot, 3 individual laws tonight. So really just a taste of it, just to get our kind of feet wet. And we begin actually with the 2nd chapter. The 2nd chapter is the most practical. So some of the chapters are more theological or philosophical. And the 2nd chapter of Hilchot Tshuva, the laws of Tshuva, is very practical. And he begins actually in some ways at the end point. So we'll begin there too. What constitutes complete Tshuva? Teshuva Gimura, a person who confronts the same situation in which they erred or in which they missed the mark, and they had the potential to err again, and nevertheless abstains and does not commit it because of their tshuva alone and not because of fear or lack of strength. So it's important to begin here to say, tshuva is not impossible. Actually, let's just go ahead and say what tshuva is. Tshuva is when we make a mistake and we encounter the possibility of making that same mistake again, and we don't. And we don't because we have changed, not because it wasn't convenient or because we were afraid someone would judge us for it, but because of our inner resolve and a process we went through by which we are actually a different person, and therefore we don't. Okay, any clarifying questions about what constitutes complete tshuva? Okay, we're going to move on to 2.2. You can always add a clarifying question. What feels very powerful to me is while the Rambam can articulate complete tshuva, he also holds by a teaching in the Talmud which clarifies ein omdim tzadikim gemurim. There's no such thing as a completely righteous person. So on the one hand, there can be any individual mistake we made has the possibility for being resolved completely, but we as people can never be outside of the need to do tshuva. We can't be perfect. That's part of what it is to be human, but there is a pathway by which we can imagine full healing and restoration. But the ability to encounter the same situation and not repeat the mistake is not enough. That's just where we're going. But he actually outlines in tremendous detail over the course of many pages what actually the process is. And I'm going to give you kind of what I would describe as the cliff notes of the process. What constitutes tshuva? In that case, tshuva was like the end goal. And here we're looking at what constitutes tshuva as in the process. A person should abandon their errors. Okay, first step, stop doing what you're doing. This is essential. I've had so many people in my life want to sort of seek my forgiveness while they continue to perpetuate the harm. It's like, no, first you have to stop doing the thing you're doing that's causing harm. We can't sort of make full resolution with our partner in a fight while we continue to yell at them, right? We have to actually first recede and cease from the action itself. Second, we need to remove whatever led us to err from our thoughts. Visiro mimachashavto. This is the most in-depth part of the process. It actually is to turn or remove, to make missing from our thoughts that which led us there. If we understand, let's take unlearning white supremacy as an example here. We can resolve in our own hearts. I can resolve in my own heart to not be racist. And I can hope and pray and try to sort of stop the racist thing I'm doing. But real tshuva is actually an inward turn. So the first step is external, stop what you're doing. But the second step, is essential step, is turn inward and reflect and understand why you were doing what you're doing, and remove whatever led you there from yourself. Step 3, resolve in your heart never to commit the thing again. Develop a conviction for change. Step 4, verbally confess to whom you have harmed. There's a lot that comes later about the consensual process of confession and in what circumstances it's actually ethically better to confess it generally versus specifically, publicly versus privately. So the confession requires a lot, but there is a direct relational aspect to tshuva in which we actually do need to verbalize and say aloud the harm we have caused. Step 5, state these matters which they have resolved in our own hearts. This is part of the confession. State it out loud. And then the implication is, and then encounter the same situation that you encountered before and don't make the same mistake. So I offer you this as the Rambam's definition of tshuva, and I want you to be holding 2 questions. Can you come to articulate in your own words the process of tshuva? And what is your own personal definition of tshuva? Okay, these are questions I hope you'll take with you. You don't need to answer them immediately, though you're welcome to in the chat. In my final moments of teaching, I wanna take you from the practical of the Rambam to the theological. We are now moving from chapter 2 of Hilchot Tshuva to chapter 7. Great, I'm seeing one clarifying question here from Annie and Alana. Wondering if the rabbis think the heart needs to be fully on board before apology repair is done, or if repair is necessary, even if the heart can't fully get there. I think fundamentally the Rambam feels the heart has to get there before repair can be made. In fact, on both sides. So most often we need to do the work of forgiving a person in our own hearts before actually a person can ask for our forgiveness. And I think similarly, we need to be able to wholeheartedly feel we're there before complete tshuva can be made. Certainly the Rambam can recognize there are stages to tshuva. If he can articulate one version of complete tshuva, there are intermediary stages. But I think for complete tshuva, yes, the heart needs to be fully resolved. Okay, we are now jumping all the way to chapter 7, the 4th halacha, the 4th teaching in the path of tshuva as the Rambam understands it. A Baal tshuva, one who is possessing the path of tshuva, one who has done tshuva, that's how they describe it, the master of tshuva, right? The person for whom tshuva is at stake, should not consider themselves distant from a level of righteousness on account of the iniquities and transgressions which they had done. This is not how it is. Rather, they are beloved and desirable in the presence of their Creator, as if they had never missed the mark. And not only that, their reward is great. For even after having tasted the flavor of missing the mark, right, the appeal of it, the ease of it, the seeming benefits of it, they separated themselves from it and overcame their inclination. The sages teach the place or the status of a person who has done teshuva. Even the holy righteous could not stand there. Their level is above the level of those who never missed the mark to begin with, for it took more to overcome their inclination. So I bring this to say, the rabbis don't want us to feel a sense of shame for the need to do tshuva. They want us to understand how human it is, and actually they valorize, validate, emphasize that a person who has the capacity to do tshuva is more righteous than a person who has never even had a need to do it. And I think that's because, first of all, there is no person who doesn't have a need to do tshuva. And second of all, because the capacity to do tshuva represents the capacity to stay in ongoing relationship with people, with land, with, intimate relationship, with collective relationship. It's about the spiritual tool that tshuva represents and how essential it is, such that we learn that actually we are better off for the need to do tshuva for what we gain through the process. So just by way of closing, what we learn is that tshuva precedes the creation of the world. it is in fact a very practical process that's within our grasp, and we are better off for knowing how to do it. And with that, I know that was a mouthful, and thank you all for your patience and your presence, and I'll turn it over to Rabbi Jessica.
I think we should take a little more time to get like some thoughts and feelings from that, because I was like at 3, you know, as Ari said at the beginning, we're just going to do 3 verses, laws, practices, and that was such juicy 3. So I'm just curious if folks want to put in the chat or just like let a moment to let that simmer of like what learnings are striking you, what feels particularly moving. Somebody wrote so good, and I would love to hear like what is so good.
Yeah, I can jump in, Rabbi Jessica. I said it was so good. This is Leo. Yeah, just feeling excited by the how shame is just completely unnecessary. And I felt that come up in many different ways in my life, and just feeling like how the process of getting through and turning towards repair is the gift. So yeah, excited to just let that marinate.
Yeah, right on. I'm just trying to cull more from the chat. Noah says that we are even more worthy, even with the need for tshuva, than never needing to make tshuva at all. I think people are finding a lot of, for me, it's very healing to have this relationship to harm and repair be a sacred process rather than a shameful one. Is one of the gifts of Jewish tradition, that missing the mark is a sacred practice, or being with harm that we've committed, being with harm that we've received is not about shame, but about a sacred repair. I really connect with the idea that repairing relationships mean you're capable of intimate, long-lasting relationships. Just allowing you to read each other's commentary. This is like it's like Talmud on the Torah, that you all get to comment, commentary on each other's thoughts. So we wanted to bring this very old Torah forward and think about, as you all are already starting to do, apply it to our work and lives right now. I know that for me, abolition can seem very overwhelming to just imagine, to imagine prisons, if you've been to a prison, to imagine those walls down, which I think is very good to practice and imagine. And then there's also the kind of like every day for those of us who are committed to not calling the police or not involving the state in harm when it happens. But we know that it does happen. And for me, that's one of the teachings of Teshuva created before the world, is that we know that harm is going to happen, actually, that's just like part of the world, that humans are going to bump into each other and hurt each other in different ways. And one of the kind of like very nitty-gritty ways that I think about applying Teshuva is, how are we going to be with harm when it happens in our movement spaces and our organizing spaces? And because that's where we want to try to practice the world to come. That's where we like live our values, and there's no, there's not a boss to rail against. There's just us trying to work together and make a different world. And we just don't have practice often, or I wasn't raised very well, like learning how to be with harm. That's the work of transformative justice, which there's so much rich Torah pouring out about transformative justice. And I really believe that Teshuva, like all of what we've been talking about harm and repair, are a tool that we can bring to how we work together in our movement spaces and how we think about transformative justice. So we wanted to name in particular that JVP has actually been doing with the racial justice transformation process, with an accountability to Palestinians, attention and focus, and with creating some guidelines about how we work together in our chapters and spaces, has actually been putting a lot of attention to both how do we come back from collective, or how do we repair collective harm, not come back from, but like really the deep work of repairing the collective harm of white supremacy and colonization, And then how do we work together? How do we speak to each other in our spaces? And who do we turn to when harm happens? So we wanted to give folks some time to actually just kind of like process this in smaller groups and think about some big questions. Ari, there's so much happening in the chat and I can't see it all at once, but Ari, will you cut in if there's something that you want to lift up from the chat? But we want to think about how experiences of tshuva in your own life, if you've had a practice around the new year of being accountable to harm or asking people to be accountable to harm, how that has happened, and if there's any lessons from tshuva, either from what we've shared tonight or other teachings that you have encountered about tshuva that you bring to, that feel to you as transformative justice, or that you bring to your movement work and organizing spaces. We wanted to ask about what it would look like to bring an abolitionist tshuva framework to our movement spaces together, and whether we believe complete tshuva in the way that Rambam lays it out is possible. So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts, or maybe that's already been part of what's happening in the chat, about ways that you've brought tshuva to movement spaces and organizing. Okay, with that, let's take a few minutes in breakouts. You can turn to a neighbor because it's hard to talk in a big group. I think hopefully Alana has breakouts ready. Beth is working on typing a long answer. Great, you can speak it to your group. So we're gonna just go into breakouts for like 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes or so to kind of process some of these big questions. I'll stick some big questions in the chat.
And maybe you can actually also set with kind of this, the implication of the flow that Jessica and I have developed is what can we learn about abolition from tshuva, and what can we learn about tshuva from abolition?
Cool. So we put some questions in the chat, and as always, as with any rabbinic question, you're welcome to ignore them and say whatever is coming to your heart and mind right now. And Alana, can you send us to rooms of 3?
Yes. And what time do you want to come back?
We'll come back at like 5 after the hour, 6 after, or 6 of, 5 of.
Okay, great.
5
Here we go.
Yeah.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Where are you located?
I'm in Minneapolis.
Oh, wow.
I'm Rabbi Jessica's housemate, so she's in the other room.
You can hear it loud and clear.
Yeah. I'm trying to keep the dog entertained while she's like.
Awesome.
Where are you?
Well, Wampanoag Land is Boston, I'm outside of Boston. Yeah, just outside. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm a staff person at JVP.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So I love this question of like, what can we learn from tshuva about abolition, and what can we learn about abolition from tshuva? And I don't know that I have any answers, but I like the question. How about?
Well, I was thinking, I didn't chat anything in the chat, but I was thinking about the question of like where spaces that sort of in organizing, I've been trying to transform harm or sort of bring that, sorry if the dog.
It's all right.
But I'm a psychologist and I work in queer and trans health. And one of the things that, as a cisgender person working in LGBT health and in trans health, is that I've been trying to sort of push for like more spaces around like repairing the harm of like the healthcare system to trans people like over the year. I mean, and this comes up, I think, just working, you know, in the medical industrial complex and like the like medical racism, like so many harms that are committed on the institutional level. Like, I think sometimes I'm like, what are ways that we can move that forward in order to repair historical harms and also transform into something that isn't causing harm as much like recapitulating that pain, but like to shift towards change. So I was just like kind of meditating on that as we were talking. That was like one thing that came up for me.
Yeah. Well, just at the very beginning when we, before we started tonight, and Jessica had the text, it's a source from JBP about, you know, how we work together, and, you know, they really like the agreements that you set up about, you know, how you're going to work, but there are also ideals, you know, like the very best that how we really want to be in relation. And I also I reminded her that we are doing the racial justice transformation and accountability to Palestinians. I think those are like two really up, but you know, at the end of the day, or not the end, at the beginning of the day, we don't, you know, we're all like pretty far away from complete teshuva. You know, it's like, man, if we have to wait for a complete teshuva, we're in trouble, because you know, I'm also a theater person, so in theater we always say fake it till you make it. You know, it's like,
right.
You know, you just,
yeah.
And I think that might be one step in teshuva. I don't know. And even like as a tool in like going towards abolition, you know, like I think people really need to like practice, you know, like not calling the police, or, you know, like not like, what would you do? How are you going to talk to your neighbor? You know, like
I think those like practical steps, like, you know, and just like, what are the small things? Because I think we can, thinking about it on these like large, big levels, it can feel like, like, what does that look like? What does that mean? But I mean, that's like, so, I mean, abolition and just, I mean, here we just had our like city council meetings about like, you know, in Minneapolis after George Floyd was murdered.
Yeah.
And, you know, our city council committed to defunding the police. But,
I know, that's amazing, but
no, it all got walked back, you know, like, so, yeah. So in the
Wow.
process of it, you know, so that is like the practicalities and the processes of it, that's the part that I'm sort of interested in, like, you know.
Yeah, we can have these really high ideals, and then when it comes down to the day-to-day, but who's gonna, like, if somebody busts into my house, who do I call?
Right, totally. And those are like the questions that I think are happening then in like smaller group. Like, I think, like, how do we then sort of model that practice or talk about that practice, or kind of like when you're talking about like just what are the practicalities of not calling the police? What are the practicalities, right? If something happens, like what's available to you, or like how do you shift like your mindset around one of like fear, or like how you respond to harm, and like think about different things, you know?
And how do you, and we can't get to that part of like not calling the police before we set up talking to our neighbors. You know, like that's the first part. And then, but we want to like defund the police, but it's like, no, we can't do that until like we know that we're going to have people in the job.
Welcome back. Thank you all for going through the Zoom portal to get thrust into conversation with a perhaps stranger about a very big topic, and for coming back. I hope everyone got to speak a few words of what is coming up for them right now. So we're going to start to close. If anybody has like burning learnings that they want to share in the chat of just what came up, would love to see them there. One thing we wanted to share is this document from JVP about how members and staff work together, which includes some process about accountability and harm, and actually the kind of like nitty-gritty of mediation and education and ground rules. And want to give a lot of like respect and love for the all of us at JVP who are the specific people who made that, and also like the practice of trying to infuse anti-racist values into practical how we work together when harm happens. I think just to close, and if you also want to say something to close, we just want to invite that this is, hopefully we've already like shown what we, you know, our full heart of this, which is that we believe that Jewish wisdom has a lot to offer to our movements for understanding, for just even conceptualizing harm and repair. And just to say that it's not easy work to actually break this down into usable, into like really usable bits that you can like, the next time you're really mad at someone or somebody has hurt you and harm has happened, to actually like call on this tradition and bring that in. And we think that that's one of the really key steps to creating larger and larger structures that will, can support us to be with harm and transform harm and be accountable to harm when it happens. Rabbi Ari, do you want to say anything else?
Yes, I'll just share. I'm going to place a chat for a resource as the sermon I referenced earlier, and Jessica was my chavruta and editor of this sermon. No Torah lives alone. So we really both had a hand in bringing that, and it has about 20 plus footnotes that have lots of other references to what I would call the Torah of Abolition. It was like the cutting room floor of all the Torah we came across in the process of compiling that sermon. So I also offer that to you as just additional learning, and to take seriously that I think part of what abolition is not just deconstruction of the systems that don't work, but you know, developing practices that do work. And so we really want to offer tshuva as a practice that is tried and true. And it's a practice that we are called to do 3 times a day in traditional Jewish prayers. It's a practice that obviously undergirds the high holidays. And so it's something that I think is kind of central to Jewish thought and also to spiritual practice. And hopefully we can find ways to lift that up in our own personal lives and have that ripple out beyond us and into the collective.
I think Melissa will be making some closing announcements.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabbi Arilev and Rabbi Jessica. Thank you, Rabbi Alyssa, for when I said we'll do 8 days of abolition, and you were, of course, one day will be Torah of Abolition. So here we are. And I want to thank the JVP Havara Network that so willingly took up the task of putting together the prayers, organizing that, thinking about structure for these events that then other people have used as well. So I want to lift up that community that we have as well. And it will be soon launching their webpage and having a big party, a big coming out party about that. I want to thank Elena Stein for being fabulous tech person, and for Rachel is our amazing captioner. So all these people who have like been here and behind the scenes, thank you so much. And you came tonight, so you know how to get here. We have still Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 5 more nights of really amazing programming. Tomorrow night is the by Jackson open mic, and that is open to everyone to come and enjoy the talents of the by Jackson and BIPOC and Palestinian artists. And then the Monday night, New York City, JVP is putting on a fabulous flirty party with the amazing team that they have there. It's a benefit for the Adala Justice Project. That's Monday night. Wednesday night is, Tuesday, the 15th. We already have 2,000 people have signed up for this panel. That is so important. It is a question of the day is like defeating this new definition of anti-Semitism. So we want to really dismantle what anti-Semitism means. And Rashida Tlaib will be there, and Mark Lamont Hill and Rabbi Alyssa Weiss will be facilitating. So it's pretty amazing. Also, on Wednesday night, prison abolition, boots on the ground. This is an international struggle, but right here in the United States, there are people who are doing the work every single day. And one group, Families for Justice as Healing, will be sharing their work, their experiences. They're quite amazing women, some men, but mostly women and young girls who are formerly incarcerated women. So they're the experts. And the last night is about defeating the deadly exchange. So for those who might not know, the deadly exchange is the trainings that are held in Israel, the police and the IDF for American cops and lawmakers. And then they bring those skills, anti-terrorist skills back, and we've seen the results, like as in Ferguson. So, and that's all funded by the ADL and JINSA, and so we're gonna have a day of action. So that is our week of abolition, anti-Zionism, anti-racism. I hope you'll join us. And thank you so much for being here. And I see people have even stayed. Amazing. Thank you so much.
You know, it's good when people want to hear the announcements. We want more.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone. May there be so much more light. Good night.
Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Happy
you.
Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. Treat. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Yeah. Happy Hanukkah. Thank you, Raf. You were here. Rebecca, yay. Thank you. Elliot, yay. Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
All my wonderful peoples.
Yes. Thank you all for being here. Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Sally. Okay, everybody. Okay, here we go.